right, let's go over the ideas in chapter 10. Okay, so this is another one of those chapters where it really is the lab's material. Traditionally, what's done is the material in chapter 11 is done before this material in chapter 10, but the Saladin text turns things around for some reason. So here we are looking at the muscular system in terms of the muscles before we get into the physiology behind it. Now, like I said, most of this is done in lab, and you're going to have 3 lab periods to go or to learn these muscles. So I'm going to qualify that. So if you look at here, let's get this slideshow going. If you look at the learning outcomes for this chapter, really up to 6 is really lecture material. 7, which goes on to the next slide, as you can see, is just a list of muscles that you're supposed to learn. And I will go over this, what I think when I get to that point in the presentation, so that you can understand what my expectations are for this. But remember, like I said, you have 3 lab periods to go over this. And I know that now you've got shortened, abbreviated lab periods for now, and hopefully we'll keep having lab. But you still have that amount of time to learn it. And like I said, I will go over that in a little bit more detail when I get to that part of the slide presentation, all right? So let's go over points 1 to 6, and so it's actually pretty short. So introduction, muscles, right? So this is the muscular system. And as I said, chapter 11 is more of the physiology as to how muscle works, all right? So a big thing here are the muscles themselves. So that's why I have this picture here. So you should be able to, a lot of those are on your list to learn. So we will get over to that in a few minutes. Now, when it comes to medicine and the human body, you can see that nearly half the body's weight is muscle. And then there's a whole bunch of fields of medicine that are devoted to muscle. And even here at Morrisville, we have an HPHP course. And for that, there's a large focus on muscle. And there's also a massage therapy course or line of study, which also requires knowledge of muscles. So depending on where you're headed, how much time you devote on this learning of muscles, as well as different aspects of muscles, is really going to reflect, how much time you should spend on this, right? I mean, if you're going to be a massage therapist, you should know where your muscles are, right? And if you eventually want to be, say, a chiropractor, if you want to grow out from that and go to chiropractic, then you really need to know this. A nursing student might not need to know as much right now unless they end up being a nurse in a place where they're treating people for muscle disorders. So, so my goal here is to just sort of give you what you need to get moving with that. Now, obviously, the percentage of the body mass is going to depend on the person, right? So if someone's highly athletic, their muscle mass is going to be higher by proportion than someone who is not. All right. So, have to qualify that. But for the average person, it's about almost half your body weight is muscle. All right. Now, there's a number of characteristics of muscle, and I kind of want to go over those and address them individually. So, of course, muscle is what we call excitable. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as irritable, which means that it's excitable. All right. And we're going to get into the physiology behind that in the next chapters, and it will move into the nervous system because it's the nervous system that makes muscle excitable. So muscle is going to respond to stimuli, electrical stimuli from the nerves, or electrochemical stimuli from neurons. And as such, we're going to learn how it does that. And then you're going to learn how the neurons do that as well in this course, all right? Now, what does it mean to be excitable or irritable? It means that the cell membrane potential is going to change in response to a stimulus, all right? And if you recall me talking about the sodium potassium pump, I said to you that every cell in the body has a charge potential across its membrane. And it's only neurons and muscle that flips that charge. And that's essentially what this means. All right. And we'll get into that in the next chapter. So, what does it do in response to that? Well, muscle contracts. The action on muscle is contraction. All right. Um, so the energy is used is to shorten the muscle, not to lengthen it. All right. In my time of teaching this, I've realized that some students think it's the other way around. No, the action is shrinking, and the reason that is a reason that students get it confused is because of the next point where we say that muscle is elastic, right? So if you have an elastic band and you stretch it, the action is stretching, and then since it's elastic, it goes back, or it shrinks back to its original size. But when you're talking about muscle, it's opposite to that. The action is shrinking or contraction, and then when muscle relaxes, it expands out to its original size because it's elastic, all right? So it recoils to the original length. It doesn't shrink to the original length. And I think that's why students sometimes misunderstand what the action is on muscle. So the action is contraction, all right, not extension, all right? And then we say that muscle is extendable. Now, when we say that, we're usually thinking about skeletal muscle, because you know you can pull your muscle, right? But you don't want to extend your cardiac muscle, right? You don't want to extend your heart. You don't want to pull your heart muscle. You know, you don't stretch your heart muscle. That's not something that you do. When the heart fills with blood, it's because the heart has relaxed, all right? It's not actively extending, all right? So, so I want to qualify this extendable thought mostly to skeletal muscle, right? So you don't, so you don't really think about it in terms of heart muscle, all right? Okay. Now, in terms of different fields, on page 1 of my notes, I list myology, which is a course of study at Morrisville, which is the study of the muscular system. So you can move on from A&P1 and go into myology, and you're just studying muscle, and that's all you're doing, all right? Now, the functions of muscle, and I really want to spend some time talking about this because I think it's sort of taken for granted without very much thought as to what these terms mean. And I think at this point, you should be thinking about it, all right? The students who do best in A&P are the ones that are actually thinking about the material, all right? So when we're talking about what does it do? Well, muscle is responsible for movement, and of course it is, but I like in my notes, I really spend time going over that. So I'm going to go over that in more detail right now. All right. So when we're talking about movement, really think about what that means. All right. I mean, in my notes, I put number 1, moving around, of course, right? You use your muscles, your skeletal muscles to move around, right? The room, or, move at, when you're working out or what, you're moving around, right? And number 2, moving body parts relative to another. Again, of course, right? So these are things that you take for granted. But I don't want you to forget about the other kinds of movement that are required, that are responsive, that are done by muscle, right? So the movement of things through the body, right, requires muscle. So the movement of air, the act of breathing is muscle. Circulation of blood requires smooth muscle. Digestion, peristalsis, and segmentation requires smooth muscle, right? The heart, the beating of the heart, that is also movement, okay? So all of these things require muscle, and the things that you might not think about intuitively. The other things that require movement are for communication. And you can see that here, and that's why I chose this picture, right? Look at what's happening with these people. You can read they're communicating to you by their facial expressions, and you have so many muscles in your face that are responsible for all of these different emotions that these people are emoting here. just by their facial expressions. And you can tell what they're feeling without hearing anything. You can just tell by what they look like. And that is also responsible by muscle. The act of speaking requires muscle. The act of writing requires muscle. Okay, other nonverbal communications like sign language requires muscle. So we require muscle movement for communication. And one really good example that you've probably seen before, right? So Stephen Hawking was a very famous physicist that I know you've seen before. And if you can't think of who I mean, just Google it. You'll go, oh, that guy, right? So he's the famous scientist, the physicist. Like, he's incredibly awesome. He's since passed because he had ALS, and because of that, he couldn't move his muscles. All right, he couldn't move his skeletal muscles, and he had given innumerable lectures and talks on his theories and traveled all over the place. And one thing that would strike you is that he couldn't. I mean, there's no facial expression that he would give, and he would speak, and I'm using the bunny ear quotes with my hands. He would speak using his computer, which was monotone, and you would tell by the words that he was using that he was being sarcastic or he was making a joke, but you couldn't tell, right? You would have to infer that by the context of the words that came from the computer that was speaking for him. And so so much was lost just from the fact that he couldn't communicate with his muscles, right? So I mean, he had other ways of communicating clearly, of controlling the computer and it voicing words for him, but that would be a good example. So you can look him up and you can see pictures of him or videos of him, and you'll see exactly what I mean, right? So here's a person that wasn't able to communicate because he could not move his muscles, all right, in the ways that we're so used to communicating with, all right? He could move his eye muscles, so that is how he was communicating. That's how he was getting his computer to speak for him. Now, and it still required muscle movement, clearly, all right? So think about that in terms of movement. So movement means a lot of things to the human condition, not just walking around the room, okay? Now, other things that you might not be thinking of, stability. There's a whole part of your brain that communicates with your muscles in terms of the tension and body position, and that's the cerebellum, as you'll learn later in the course. So you need muscle for that. So posture and muscle tension. Opening of passageways, so the control of sphincters, right? So the opening of the pyloric sphincter to release your chyme into the digestive system, into the small intestine, is a sphincter. You've got precapillary sphincters in your circulatory system that control how much blood goes into the capillary beds. So there's opening and closing of passageways and containers. All right, heat production, right? So if you're shivering, you're gonna shiver, and the reason you're shivering is you're generating heat. And then a huge part in glycemic control, so the control of blood glucose levels. Muscle, since it's active, it needs a lot of ATP. So one of the easiest ways to generate energy from food is using glucose. So the muscles really are a sink for glucose, so because they need to make ATP. So of course, then they have a huge role to play in your glycemic control, or your blood sugar levels. All right. So hopefully those things make sense to you, and it's not just memorizing things by rote, which I hate. I hate it when students do that. So make sure that this makes sense to you. All right. Now, getting into how muscle is organized. So we use skeletal muscle as the teaching tool, all right? But you should understand that muscle in general is highly organized, and connective tissue organizes it, all right? So there's like, and if it wasn't so, things wouldn't work very well. And we use, like I said, skeletal muscle so that you understand this a little bit better, so you can imagine it, okay? So first of all, remember that skeletal muscle fibers can be incredibly long, right? So, and I always use the sartorius muscle as the example. So the sartorius muscle stretches from the outer part of the hip to the inner part of the knee. And understand that in this muscle belly, the cells are that long. all right? It's not multiple cells making up the length of this muscle. One muscle fiber stretches from the hip to the knee, okay? So in so doing, you're in development, many muscle or myoblasts, so muscle forming cells, fuse to make these very long cells. And this is why skeletal muscle fibers have so many nuclei, right? Because you can't have one nucleus way up here by the hip and expect all of that information to get down here to the inner part of the knee, all right? So these are multinucleated cells. These are the only type of muscle that are multinucleated for that very reason, because they're so incredibly long. Yes, you need a microscope to see in the individual fibers, but that doesn't change the fact that they're that long, all right? So of course, if you're going to have a situation with these incredibly long cells that are microscopic, right, that you need a microscope to see, they need to be organized as they go through their contraction and then their recoil, their relaxation, using their elasticity, okay? So in order to guide that, you need to have the organization dictated by the connective tissue that's going to be supporting these muscles, all right? So if we look at this in a little bit more detail, all right, so remember, muscle is joined to bone via tendons. And I've already said once already, at least once, that the tendons, as do the ligaments, grow out from the periosteum, that connective tissue that surrounds your muscle, your bone, all right? So it grows out from that, and it's continuous with the outer layer of connective tissue that surrounds a muscle belly, all right? And that muscle, that connective tissue is called the epimysium, all right? And it's on the outside of the muscle. Now, outside of that, we can have this connective tissue organization called fascia. So fascia is a sheet of connective tissue that's going to separate different muscle groups, but individual muscles in those groups are going to have around them an epimysium, all right? And in certain cases, the fascia and the epimysium are inseparable. They're sort of connected to each other, all right? So that's something to keep in mind as you're learning this, all right? Now, notice on the inside, when you're looking at the muscle belly proper, you can see these bundles of muscle fibers, right? So each of these little circles here is supposed to be a muscle cell, all right, or a muscle fiber. And these bundles of muscle cells are called fascicles. And around each fascicle is another layer of connective tissue called the perimysium, right? So this perimysium is surrounding this. And if you want to know where I'm at in my notes, I'm on page 3, all right? So there's this thick layer of connective tissue around that. And in between the fascicles and within this perimysium are the blood vessels and the nerves, all right? So they stretch out through that. Now, I also listed on page 3 in the middle about cooking meat, right? So, you know, if you cook meat, when it's raw, you can see some fat sort of stuff, but it looks pretty homogeneous other than that, right? Unless you really look at it carefully. But once you cook it, you can see like the chunks of meat, right? And if you really look at it, those chunks of meat are actually the fascicles. And what's happening after you cook it, the proteins that make up this connective tissue of the perimysium have been denatured. So now you can see the individual fascicles a little bit better, all right? So that's at the macroscopic scale. You can already see that, all right? Now, inside each fascicle are the muscle cells or the muscle fibers, right? And they're also surrounded by connective tissue. That layer of connective tissue is called the endomysium. All right, so that's between the fibers, and deep to the endomysium is the cell membrane. All right, so understand that, and therefore the neuronal the terminal end bulbs that communicate with the muscle, as well as the capillary beds. Obviously, capillaries have to be able to penetrate this to feed these incredibly long cells when we're talking about skeletal muscle. All right, so this is perforated by these connections with circulation and with the nervous input, all right? So hopefully that makes sense, all right? So if you look here, you can see what it actually looks like. And notice that there's 2 fascicles. They're at right angles to each other. Here's one fascicle here. Here's another fascicle here, all right? Another set of fascicles here. So you can see each in this sort of muscle belly. You can see the muscle fibers here. This whole thing is a fascicle. you've got actually, these are, you know, the actual cells themselves you can see here. So around each fascicle is the perimysium, and then the endomysium would be around each one of these cells, all right? So if we go in order from superficial to deep, so outside, the outermost would be the fascia, then the epimysium, which could be contiguous, and then around the fascicles, you have the perimysium, so then you have your fascicle. So inside your fascicle, you have your muscle fibers, and each one is surrounded by an endomysium, which is superficial to the actual cell membrane of the fibers themselves, all right? So hopefully that makes some sense. Now, the fascicles themselves are oriented in certain ways in muscle, and this gives, in this orientation is important for the functionality in the way the muscle pulls, all right? So there's a set of terms that are used to describe these formations. So they're fusiform, parallel, triangular, pennate, and circular. So I'm going to sort of go through these here. So if you look at fusiform, they're tapered on each end, and the belly in the middle is expanded, all right? And then parallel would be like the rectus abdominis, or your abs, right? So you have your six-pack. That's considered parallel. So, you know, it's parallel, the uniform width in parallel fibers. And then triangular, right? Just like a triangle, it's going to be broader on one end and tapered on the other. So that would be an example of that. And in my notes, I have another name for triangular. It can also be called convergent. And then we have pennate. I'm going to come to these in a sec. So pennate, and then circular, right? So circular, you can see here, there's typically not an attachment to bone, which causes a problem about something else, which I'll get to shortly, but this would be around your mouth, around your eyes, for example. That would be circular muscle. Now this pennate means like a feather, all right? So pennate has a few forms. So you can have unipennate, where the feathery part is only on one side of a main tendon here. And bipennate, it would be sort of like the feather growing out from each side of the tendon. And then you can have multipennate, where you have a bunch of feathers coming together and connecting at a single point. All right, so that's multipennate. So those are the different terms in terms of the orientation of the fascicles. All right. Now, the other term is a muscle compartment. So this is when you have a group of muscles. Remember, I said fascia sort of surround muscle groups. So around muscles that would have a similar function. All right. So that would be those muscles inside that fascia are called a muscle compartment. And different muscle compartments, or the fascia between that, are separated by what's called an intramuscular septa, which is really thick fascia that's separating different compartments. And that's what this diagram is trying to show you. So you can see there's different compartments in different colors here, and you can see that they're separated, all right, just so that you can understand how these work. So, because as we'll see, different muscles work together or against each other, all right? All right, now other terms to learn. And these might seem very similar at the outset, but I will show you how they're different. So one is called an aponeurosis, and this is a very broad tendon, like a very flat sheet. Okay, there's one on the head that's that I'll show you later. Actually, maybe it's even on this slide, so you can sort of see it. Yeah, here is one here. It doesn't have the name of it listed here, but it will later, so you can see it here. So that's a very broad tendon. And then the other one, like you can see, is on the palm, is another example here, right? So the palmar aponeurosis. So this is a tendon that's connected to muscle, all right? A very broad tendon, and there's going to be muscle attached. But you can also have a very broad sheet of connective tissue that's going to separate tendons from different muscles, and those are called a retinaculum. And here in the foot, you can see that. You also have some of these in the hand that aren't shown on here. Well, they're shown, but they're not labeled. But here you can see some that are labeled. These are not tendons. They're not connecting muscle. but there are sheets of connective tissue that are separating this complex set of tendons that we have. And typically around in the foot, there's quite a number of these. You can see some of them listed here. As well as in the hand, you'll also see them. We'll get to that. So those are two other terms to learn, all right? Now, the other thing is the idea of origin and insertion, all right? So the origin of a muscle is supposed to connect to the stationary bone, all right? So that's the bone that doesn't move. And then the insertion, so the origin is to the stationary and the insertion is to the moving bone, all right? And this is across a joint, all right? So here's an example. So here, the humerus, there's the insertion there because the humerus is moving, and that is then connected to the spine here, where the origin of the muscle is, all right? So during a contraction, the insertion is pulled towards the origin because remember, the action is contraction. Now, the problem with these terms, and this is why I don't stack that much importance to them, is because they don't fit for every muscle, or they can vary depending on the type of movement, and then it gets really confusing. So you can see in my notes on page 5, I said often these terms don't fully describe a muscle movement, and then list superior, inferior, proximal, distal. So what ends up being used are anatomical directional terms, practically speaking, to talk about the different ends of the muscle. So the superior end of the muscle, the inferior end of the muscle, the proximal end or the distal end of a muscle, instead of origin and insertion, okay? And this gets very confusing. And then sometimes there's muscles that aren't even connected to bone. So then what do you call the origin and the insertion, right? So for example, around your mouth, there's your mouth muscle, the circular muscle around the orbicularis oris, is not connected to bone. So what then do you say the origin? And if you look at it, the origin and the insertion is in the same place, and it's not to bone. So what do you do there, right? So, so I will apologize in advance because the learning outcomes set by people long before I came to the school for the lab ask you to list the origin and insertion for all of these muscles in lab, and your homework asks you to do that. And the instruction there is to use your lab manual and, go through this, because the act of writing helps you remember things, all right? But, use the study guide as a way of knowing exactly which ones I think you should know, or that you should know for the test. Because these terms are really weird. And even speaking with faculty that we used to have, Dr. Lotz, who was a chiropractor, he didn't even like using these terms, and yet at Morrisville, he still had to teach them because that's what we do. And in so many ways, it's nonsensical. But anyways, that's my feeling about it. But what you should do is learn what these mean, because in some muscles, these terms make sense, right? And for example, the biceps and the triceps, these terms make very good sense for those muscles, but you'll find that sometimes it's really confusing, all right? So please learn the terms, understand what they mean. But when you find yourself trying to assign an origin and an insertion for certain muscles and you feel confused, of course you do, all right? So don't be surprised by that, okay? All right, other terms, intrinsic versus extrinsic muscles. So intrinsic means within an area, right? So the intrinsic muscles of the hand, for example, which are being used as the example on the slide, those are muscles that are in the hand that are responsible for movement of the hand. But when you're talking about the body, you can have muscles that are outside that region that also influence movement of that part. Those would be extrinsic. And again, the hand is a really good example because there's muscles out in the lower part of the arm whose tendons extend into the hand that affect movement. So the extension and flexion of the hand, flexors and extensors, are actually out of the hand proper. So those would be called extrinsic muscles. You'll find the same thing in the foot. So the hands and the feet are very good for looking at intrinsic and extrinsic muscles. There's other ones as well. So movement of some of the arm muscles, as you see here, you can see that this muscle is actually not, you'll learn which one this is in a few minutes. This one is actually not in the arm proper, but clearly it's affecting the movement of the arm. So this would be an extrinsic muscle, all right? Okay. Now, antagonistic muscle pairs. So very often muscles work in opposition to each other, because remember, the action of a muscle is contraction, all right? So, and again, using the biceps and the triceps, these are really good examples of antagonistic muscles, because in order to complete the action, you have to have an antagonistic pair, right? If you take English, right, the antagonist is always the one that's rebelling against the protagonist, right? So it's always the one that's opposite. So here you have your biceps. So the action of flexion is contraction of the bicep, but in order for it to contract, the triceps has to relax. And then when the arm is extending, the triceps has to contract and the biceps have to relax. So those are antagonistic pairs. In order to, so they're working opposite to each other, all right? Synergistic muscles, on the other hand, contract together, so they support the same movement, right? So muscles that contract together to complete a movement. So, so here, if you're looking at the biceps again, there's two muscles that also contract when the biceps contract, so the brachialis and the brachioradialis, and they're going to support that contraction. So they're called synergists to that, all right? So hopefully that makes some sense. So if we look at this whole thing, so the prime mover, which if we use our antagonist, analogy, or the prime mover is the agonist. So the main muscle that's producing the most force in that movement, all right? So if the biceps is contracting and the arm's flexing, the agonist or the prime mover is the biceps. And it is supported by the brachialis and the brachioradialis, which are the synergists. And its antagonist, of course, is the triceps. So it would be working opposite to that, all right? Then there's other muscles that are called fixators. And these ones are other collections of muscles that are going to prevent the movement of the bone. So they're going to sort of support, prevent the odd movement of the bone, is what I mean. So you don't get some sort of wobble of the bone, all right? So those are fixator muscles, all right? And they're just adding stability to the system. Now, innervation of the bone, of the muscles. So you have spinal nerves and you have cranial nerves. The number of spinal nerves you have is the number of vertebrae you have plus one, because there's one spinal nerve at the top, and they're paired. Okay, and I can't remember the number right now. I don't know why I didn't put it on the slide, and I don't know why I didn't put it in my notes, but you're going to have a whole unit on spinal cord, and you're going to learn some of these nerves. But those are your spinal nerves. They're arising from the spinal cord, and then outside of the spinal cord, very, very often they have these plexus or plexi or plexuses, I don't know what the plural is, which is a network of nerves that sort of that are close to the spinal column. So you can see some of them here. So the lumbar plexus, the femoral, sacral plexus, and I have another slide where there are here, brachial plexus. All right, so sort of collections of these nerves, all right? Then you also have 12 cranial nerves, all right? So spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord, they're gonna, in between the intervertebral foramina, and they're going to be working on muscles below the neck, whereas cranial nerves are gonna come out through the skull, and they're going to innervate muscles of the head and neck, all right? Except for one of the cranial nerves. So again, these are paired again. So cranial nerves 1 to 12. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve, and it is called the wanderer. It's the one that goes through the body and does all kinds of crazy stuff, but you'll learn about it later when you do brain and spinal cord, all right? So just qualify that for now. So step by step, right? So cranial nerves and spinal nerves are responsible for the movement of, or the sending signals to the muscles, all right? So here you can see that here in general, the different plexuses from the spinal nerves, and then you can sort of count how many spinal nerves you have here, okay? And then there's the cranial nerves, and here number 10 is the vagus nerve, but the rest of them, and you're gonna have to learn this later, what the different cranial nerves innervate, or what kinds of muscles or actions are manifested by signals from them, all right? Okay, now the blood supply, which is another learning outcome, is to understand. So remember, since you know about half your body mass is muscle, clearly a lot of blood supply is going to that, because there's going to be waste gases, waste nutrients, all kinds of stuff that's going to be going around because of that. So you need a good devotion of the blood supply. So per minute, you think about 5 liters of blood. So per minute, 1.24 liters of blood at rest. Okay, so basically a quarter of the blood around dish, right? Because it's 1.24. But during exercise, look how much more. You're going to have circulation of 11.6 liters per minute, because that movement that you're doing during exercise, and the movement of the blood and the heart and all of that requires oxygen, and the blood has to do that and take away the CO2 waste, as well as other wastes as byproducts of making ATP, right? So the capillaries are going to be really extending through, like I said, that endomysium to reach every fiber to do that. And that's what this image is showing you, some of that, that network of blood capillaries going, sort of wrapping around and extending through the endomysium for this very long muscle fiber, okay? Now, naming muscles, which is a big deal for you. So when you're naming them, or you're trying to figure out the name, or you have a name and you're trying to figure out where that muscle is, there's a few ways that you can, if you just have the wherewithal to actually look at the name and see what it's telling you, all right? So the location can be in the name. So tibialis anterior. So this is telling you that it's a muscle that's on the anterior side of the tibia, right? And that's one of the ones you need to learn, all right? So hopefully that makes sense. The size of the muscle is interpreted here. So gluteus maximus, very large muscle at your glutes, right? So your butt, right? Number of attachments, so biceps and triceps, right? So the biceps is going to have 2 attachments, triceps 3. So it's sort of telling you that in the name. The direction of the fibers, so the transversus abdominis, or the transverse abdominis, right? So that's you've got 4 sets of abdominal muscles. The transversus is the one that transverses the abdomen. Guess what, right? So hopefully that will help you. I'm going to show you a little bit about that in a bit. The attachment, so the stylohyoid, so that's the stylus process. Here, the styloid process of the temporal bone going to the hyoid muscle, right? The hyoid bone, so that muscle is extended between the hyoid and the styloid process, all right? Sternocleidomastoid, right? From the sternum to the mastoid process, all right? So that would make sense, right? So it's telling you that right in the name of the muscle. Sometimes they're telling you the action. So the levator scapulae, which will raise the scapula. Adductor magnus is going to adduct, a very large muscle that's adducting, all right, instead of abducting. So, and then the tensor tympani is going to add tension, all right, to something, all right. So you can see the name is telling you something. And then you can have a combination of that, right? So fibularis longus, so that would be a long muscle around the fibula, and the fibularis brevis, so it's brief, a short muscle, and then lo and behold, there's the longus, and then there's the brevis, all right? So, that's sort of part of doing that. All right, so now, a big thing, like I said, is naming muscles. You've got 3 weeks in lab to sort of go over this. When it comes to lecture, use the study guide, all right? And if you go back, I'm going to go back to the learning outcomes, and I'm going to walk you through some of the resources I'm giving you. I'm not going to, you got to just learn some of these. But in my notes, I sort of give you a plan of action. if I was you. All right. So here you have your incredibly long list of terms. So what I would do first is learn where they all are. All right. There's this one here. You're not going to find a picture of it in my slide presentation because this is actually with the eye. I don't even know why it's in this chapter's learning outcomes, but there it is. But you'll find it later when we do the eye. All right. So the rest of them, knock yourself out. Get going on them. All right. You've got time in lab. You've got time. This lecture is supposed to be 2 classes if I would normally do it. So it gives you some time to go over that. So use it. And that would be the first thing I would do is learn where they are. All right. There's going to be some here that you don't have in lab. Because in lab, I'll point out to that, we don't have any way of seeing any of the deep muscles. And some of these muscles are deep. All right. And then it says identify the action. So, use your judgment. Some of them are going to be pretty obvious right away what their action is. All right. And then this whole thing with origin and insertion. And like I said, I apologize in advance for lab where you're going to make lists of origins and insertions. Do that last and use, at least for me, the study guide for lecture to give you guidance as to which ones you should learn, right? I think it's most important at your level of AMP to just learn where these guys are as well as the names, all right? Which is really hard. Like for me, if you know me, I really, really, really suck at learning names of people, never mind muscles. And I feel like every semester when I get to this point, I'm relearning a lot of these again. I'm at the point where some of them I kind of know, like some of them I know, obviously. I've been doing this long enough. Some of them I just know now after 10 years. And other ones, I'm like, I always need to refresh my memory as to where they are. All right. So I get it. This is really daunting. So start with learning the names and where they are. All right. And then I think that is a huge thing if you manage to do that. All right. So don't kill yourself with all of these origins and insertions. So what I did is and also because sometimes they don't mean much, but anyways, what I did is I pulled out a bunch of slides from the Saladin text to use. All right. So this one isn't from the Saladin text. This is from a Tortora text that I used years ago. But it sort of gives you the idea, right? So here you've got your biceps. You should know where that is now because I've shown you this several times. The origin is the scapula, okay? And the insertion is the radius down here, right? So remember, the insertion is attached to the moving bone, right? And the action, what is it? Well, rotate and flex the arm. So this is where it gets confusing because the actions, pronating and flexing are 2 different things, right? Right? So, those are 2 different actions, but this muscle does both. And that's why it gets really tough, even just for the biceps. And then the triceps, the origin is the scapula near the shoulder joint, the upper and lateral and posterior sites of the humerus. It's triceps. There's 3 of them, right? There's 3 parts. And the insertion is the back of the olecranon process of the ulna, right? So there's 1 insertion, 3 origins. And the action is to straighten or extend the arm. So at least here the action is straightforward, all right? So you see what I mean, right? So like I said, you've got lots of stuff on your plate. So, really just at first try to learn where these are. And some of these will come as you're writing out your notes. That's why for my homework that, and I know Dr. Nyberg is using it, just writing these things out is helping you learn, right? And it will start to make sense the more you do this. And the more you do this depends on where you're headed in the field, right? In the healthcare field, all right? But learning where these muscles are is useful. So hopefully you can at least try to do that. So let's look at this. So here's the frontalis. So here's your aponeurosis. There it is. There's the name of Galea aponeurotica. And I always forget this name. It's weird. But it's here. And like I said, I'm really bad with names. So this is your aponeurosis. Here's your frontalis muscle. And it's right by the frontal bone. Orbicularis oculi, right, around the eyes. Zygomaticus major and minor. Platysma. Now this one was the one that really got me when I came to Morrisville because this is a superficial muscle. And I was teaching lab long before I was allowed to teach lecture here. And it's a superficial muscle, but there's not 1 model in our lab that has the platysma on it. So don't try to look for it, it's not there. But here's the platysma. It's a very superficial muscle in the neck. Then you have your orbicularis oris. Oris would be mouth. And then you have your buccinator. That would be your cheeks. And then your masseter is going to help you masticate your food, all right? So here you can see the temporalis muscle right over the temporal bone, occipitalis muscle over the occipital bone. So those are useful. Here's the sternocleidomastoid. That we can see on our models, but not the platysma, which would be superficial to it. So it's really weird. Here's another view of the buccinator. All right, so notice that the masseter is superficial to the buccinator. All right. All right, so now here, this we're gonna do with another muscle in a bit. So here, notice the zygomaticus minor is this one, and major is this one. And I know that you can get these confused because you might be thinking major should be more superior to the minor, but it's not. It's reversed. It goes by how long the muscle is. So the major is the longer muscle, and the minor is the shorter muscle. All right, just so you know, there's these little pitfalls in learning. Now, for some reason, and I don't quite understand this, but there's all these hyoid muscles attached to the hyoid bone that you're supposed to learn as your learning outcomes. So I included these here. I'm really not sure why this is such a major thing, because I can't see a massage therapist looking for these muscles. Maybe there's something about massage therapy, I don't know, as well as people who are in HP, yet it's listed as a major learning outcome. So I have this slide here showing you where these are. These are not, well, you can just stylohyoid. I used that one before, but here you can see some of them. And then this slide shows you exactly which ones. And there's this diastric, which is also associated with it. So it's like, there's a lot of muscles associated with the hyoid bone. I don't know if that's why they were originally put in this course, just so that you could appreciate how many muscles are attached to the hyoid bone, because it does not articulate with anything else. Anyways, I don't know, but that's what they are. I've got this slide for you. And here's more. So here's your scalenes over here. So these ones I always have trouble remembering because there's several of them here, but there they are. They're neck muscle. These ones you should learn, absolutely. Internal and external intercostals, because you're going to need them as well in AMP2. These are your muscles of breathing. Some of your, not your main muscle of breathing, but they're involved in inhalation and exhalation for deep inhalation, forced exhalation. So make sure you learn those because they're going to be important. And then of course the diaphragm. Wow, I really find it weird when I ask students to identify the diaphragm and they don't know where that is. There's no other muscle there. This is the muscle between, this is your muscle of breathing, all right? This is it, your diaphragm. No diaphragm, no breathing. So, so learn this. It's the one that's between your thoracic and abdominal cavities, that separation. That's your diaphragm, all right? So you should know this one, all right? So, I always know if a student didn't study, if I put a label for this in lab and the student doesn't get it, I'm like, okay, you didn't study. All right, so make sure you know this one. So internal and external intercostals and the diaphragm, all right? Okay, now I can't speak today. Pectoralis minor and pectoralis major. The minor is here, you can see it. Your intercostals, here's your internal intercostals again, and external labeled here as well. Now, I mentioned to you the transverse abdominal, right? But there's 3 other muscles that are abdominal: internal abdominal oblique, external abdominal oblique, and rectus abdominis, all right? So transverse abdominis, the fibers are going transverse across the abdomen, all right? Then the rectus abdominis, this is the one that is vertical, right? Up and down. Now the internals and the externals, they are at angles. They're at oblique angles to that in opposite directions, all right? So make sure you can tell those apart, all right? So here's your pectoralis major, right? So here's your pectoralis minor. You can see it attaching to the ribs there. And major is the one that you see, all right? So those are your pecs, all right? So that one you should know. Lats dorsi, all right, is here. In lab, serratus anterior is there, but it doesn't seem to be listed for lecture for some weird reason. But serratus for lab, that would be like a serrated knife, right? So that's the one that looks like this serration, all right? So hopefully that will help you, but that's for lab. It's, for some reason, I didn't see it on the lecture list. Maybe it is and I just missed it, but there it is. And then here's and here you can see the directionality of the fibers, right? So here's your external and here's your internal. Notice how the fibers they're oblique to the transverse and the rectus abdominis, but they are also opposite to each other, all right? Sometimes that's easier to look at on a model. So then here on the back, so here's your trapezius, okay? And here's your sternocleidomastoid up here, right there, all right? Here's your traps. So here you can see it makes sort of like a diamond on the back. Then there's your deltoid. So in lab, you're going to see that there's 3 parts to the deltoid, which will throw you, but you'll find them if you Google it. You know, the parts of the deltoid, you'll see the names of that. And then here's your lats again. So here you can see the full lats. Okay, glutes. Notice you've got your gluteus medius, then you got your maximus, and then your minimus. So your minimus is deep to both the medius and the maximus, and the medius is superior to the maximus, all right? So hopefully that helps a little bit. You've got your rhomboid minor and major, all right? So look at minor, and then then lower than that is major. So again, don't get thrown. It's talking about the size, all right? So the major is the bigger one, and the minor is the smaller one, even though the minor is more superior to the major. The same thing with the teres minor and major, all right? The teres minor is the smaller one, but it's superior to the major, all right? So yeah, I'm gonna look at these again here. I'll get to that. So now here are the deep muscles. So you're not gonna see them at all in lab because we don't have a model that shows the deep. But here you've got these, and I'm really bad with the deep ones because I've always been focused on lab since I got here. But here you can see where they're at in terms of what you need to learn. So here's your deltoids again. Here's your triceps brachii. You got your 3 heads, right? Then your biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis. So make sure you can keep those straight. Here's your lats again. Teres major and minor. So you can see this again. The minor is more superior to the major. Now here, supraspinatus, it's superior to the spine of the scapula, and then the infraspinatus is inferior to that spine, all right? So these are part of your rotator cuff along with the teres minor, all right? So I have a slide just for that because there's 4 muscles in the rotator cuff. You don't see the 4th one here. So here's a rotator cuff. So here's your infraspinatus, and your supraspinatus, right? So, and here's your spine, and then your teres minor. So the teres major is not part of the rotator cuff, all right? The 4th one is the subscapularis. Notice that it's on the inner side of the scapula, all right? The subscapularis is on the inside of the body, all right? So, you know, here's your skin, here's your, you know, the other ones, and here's the bone, and here's the subscapularis, all right? So it's more anterior if you look at it that way. Okay, and that's your rotator cuff. Then here are the ones that rotate the forearm. So pronator quadraticus, pronator teres, and then there's a supinator, which would be the antagonist to that. All right. And then here are your ones that control the hand, all right? So here's, you know, more to learn, all right? So that should help you there. And then on the other side, you've got your extenders. So you've got your flexors on one side, and your extenders on the other. So you can see here again, you can see that these are all extrinsic muscles, right? So that they're all attached to your carpals and they're you know, doing their thing, all right? Then the hip and femur. So these ones are the deep muscles. Hopefully they'll, you know, this slide helps you with that. You know, the gracilis here is, you know, is superficial, but it's this, you know, right here on the medial side of the thigh. Then here's your glutes again, right? So your gluteus medius. Remember, the minimus is deep to both the medius and the maximus. And there's your gracilis again. It's right here on the lateral side. I mean, sorry, on the medial side. Sorry, medial side. And then you've got your hamstrings. Okay, so you've got your biceps femoris, your semitendinosus, and your semimembranosus. See other highlights to help you with here. And then you have to do your quads, which is your vastus intermedialis, your rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, and vastus medialis. So you have to know your quads as well and where they're at. This is the only picture I could find of the tensor fasciae latae. This is, you know, the gracilis was on the medial side. The tensor fasciae latae, that's going to be on the lateral side of your thigh. Let me just see here. Now the other ones to keep straight. So here I'm going to show you. I have to see there's on the last slide. But here's your tibialis anterior that we were talking about before. And then here you can see that you've got these extrinsic muscles that are controlling your feet. So the extensor hallucis longus, you have to know this for lab, which is why I'm highlighting it. That one is attached to the hallus, right? Okay, let's look over here. So the gastrocnemius, that's the big muscle on the posterior side of the lower leg. It's got two heads, all right? And the soleus is deep to that. And you can see both of these in lab. The lab, this is one deep muscle you can see in lab. And the way the model works is that you can take the heads off of the gastrocnemius and then you can see the soleus. Yeah, okay. And then here's your popliteus. This one's a really deep one inside the knee. And then here's your other ones. Here's your tibialis posterior. Remember I said that there's a one posterior tibialis muscle. It's right there. And then here you've got these extrinsic muscles that control the flexion of the foot. All right. Yeah, okay. And I think that's it. All right. So hopefully that helps me walking you through some of those muscles. And then hopefully you'll remember some of what I said. And you know, little things that help me keep them straight. And hopefully that will help. And anyway, so that's it.